April of the year 591. A pope steps into the pulpit in Rome. In 4 sentences, he turns the woman closest to Christ into a prostitute. His name was Gregory, the woman was called Mary, and that lie will stand for 1400 years. The homily has a number, 33, a dated text signed and filed in the Vatican archives. Who made that decision, and how could one man alone rewrite the identity of a woman who had been dead for 5 centuries? The answer lies in a precise institutional mechanism. You're about to see it. But before we step into that Roman pulpit, we have to go back to a dawn, much earlier, long before Gregory ever existed. A garden just outside Jerusalem. The air is still cold, that particular chill that comes before sunrise, when the dew has not yet dried on the stone. A woman walks alone along the path. She is carrying spices, oils for a body. She has not slept. 2 days earlier, she watched the man she followed die on a cross. And now she has come to finish what the rush of Friday evening did not allow, to prepare the body properly for burial. Her name is Mary of Magdala. In the small cloth bag she carries close to her, there is a flask of nard, a thick, expensive oil, bought with the savings of several months. She has been holding on to that flask since the day before without opening it, without even really looking at it, the way you hold on to an object that still gives you one task to carry out when everything else has fallen apart. To prepare a body is a work of the hands, washing, anointing, wrapping, a gesture that does not require understanding, only action. She clings to it because it is the only thing left to do for him. She arrives at the tomb, and the stone, the huge stone, sealed, guarded, has been rolled away. The opening is black, gaping, empty. Imagine the exact sensation, the breath catching, the blood pounding at her temples, her hands tightening around the cloth holding the oils she will never use. At that moment, she is not witnessing a miracle. She is seeing a theft, a desecration, a disappearance she does not yet understand. She runs to get the other disciples. They come, they look, they leave. She does not. She stays, alone before the black opening, weeping. Everyone has lived through a moment like this in one form or another. Not the tomb itself, but that exact instant when something you thought was settled, finished, taken care of, suddenly turns out to be gone. A door you push that gives way with no resistance. A drawer you open and find empty of what you left there. The shock that comes before understanding, that brief interval when the body already knows something is wrong, before the mind has found the words to name it. Mary Magdalene lived through that interval, magnified to the scale of an entire life of faith. And she stays when everyone else leaves, because sometimes staying is the only thing you still get to choose. And it is in the middle of those tears that a man speaks to her. At first, she takes him for the gardener. Then he says her name, one word, Mary, and she knows the voice. That moment is recorded in the Gospel according to John, chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Not a myth, not a legend, not an interpretation. A canonical text, accepted by every branch of Christianity, read every year in churches all over the world. And that text says something very specific. Mary Magdalene is alone at the empty tomb. Alone when the risen Christ speaks to her first. The sole recipient of that famous line, "Do not hold on to me. Noli me tangere," in the Latin that would echo through the centuries. She is then given an order. Direct, unmistakable. Go find the apostles, the men still hiding for fear of the Roman authorities, and tell them that the tomb is empty, that Christ is alive. A woman sent to announce to the apostles themselves the founding event of the entire Christian faith. This fact was given a name very early in the history of the church, long before Gregory, long before the lie that was still to come. In the 3rd century, the theologian Hippolytus of Rome already calls her Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. That title would survive for centuries. It would later be used by Thomas Aquinas himself, one of the pillars of Catholic theology, who employs it without hesitation in his Summa Theologica. Remember that phrase. It will come back. Because here is what stands out once you place the two facts side by side. On the one hand, the church fathers themselves, in the early centuries, recognized in Mary Magdalene a status of authority almost without equal. The messenger chosen by the risen Christ in person, even before the men who would become the founders of the institution. On the other hand, 6 centuries later, a pope climbs into the pulpit and speaks 4 sentences that will bury her beneath an identity no gospel ever gives her. In between those two, something happened. An operation. Not a quirk of translation, not some innocent mistake by a tired copyist. A decision made in a specific context by a man who had very specific reasons for making it. That is the case file we are opening today. That is why this name, Mary Magdalene, has carried for 1400 years a label that does not belong to her. That is why, when you think of her today, the image that probably comes to mind is not a messenger in the garden, but a repentant sinner, hair falling loose, kneeling before Christ in hundreds of paintings hanging in Europe's museums. That image exists, but it was manufactured. To manufacture it, there had to be a place, a date, a specific context, and that place still exists today. The Basilica of St. Clement in Rome, on the Lateran Hill, not far from where Gregory preached. You can still go there now, descend below the level of the modern street, through the stacked layers of centuries of construction, down to the foundations of a much older church, the very one where, in the year 591, the words were spoken that would seal Mary Magdalene's fate for the next 1500 years. The stones have not moved. Only the meaning of what was said there kept producing its effects, generation after generation, long after Gregory's voice had fallen silent. To understand how, we first have to understand what it replaced, and why that replacement was never enough to erase the truth completely. Because another text exists, a text the church never included in the Bible, a text rediscovered in the 20th century, buried in the sand, and bearing in its very title the name of that woman. The Gospel according to Mary. This document tells a scene the official Gospels do not. A confrontation, after the resurrection, between Mary Magdalene and one of the most powerful apostles in the early church. A confrontation over one simple and brutal question. Who has the right to speak in Christ's name? We will see exactly what this text says, where it was found, and why its publication was delayed for decades. But before that, there is a third thread to follow. Because while Rome was manufacturing its lie, another memory survived, far from councils, far from papal homilies. A legend took root in Provence, on the shores of the Mediterranean, claiming that Mary Magdalene ended her life not in shame, but in voluntary exile, as a hermit, revered by generations of pilgrims who never accepted the story of the repentant prostitute. That popular memory made it through 8 centuries without breaking. It still exists today in a cave in the south of France, where the faithful climb every year. Why did this legend survive there, when elsewhere Gregory's falsehood took hold without resistance? The answer comes down to one exact place, a rocky coastline and the name of a mountain we are about to speak. But first, we have to go back to Rome. We have to step into that pulpit in April of 591 and hear what Gregory I actually said, sentence by sentence, right up to the precise moment when three separate women from the Gospels are fused into one, before an audience with no way to verify what it is being told. Remember, the church fathers themselves called Mary Magdalene the apostle to the apostles. But here's what Gregory did next, and no one in that Roman congregation could stop him. April 591, the pulpit of St. Clement. Gregory delivers his 33rd homily. It survives, it is dated, and it can still be read today in the collections of the church fathers. And what it contains comes down to a single act of stitching. Three distinct women from the Gospels sewn together into one single identity. The first, Mary Magdalene, the messenger of the empty tomb, the one we just saw running through the garden. The second, Mary of Bethany, sister of Lazarus and Martha, described in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, a devout, respected woman who receives Christ into her home. The third, an unnamed sinful woman, no name, described in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verse 36. A woman who enters the house of a Pharisee during a meal, weeps at Christ's feet, and wipes her tears with her hair let down. The text never gives her name. Never. Gregory takes these three women, three lives, three stories, three contexts separated by whole chapters, and melts them into one. A single sentence is enough to seal the act. She whom Luke calls the sinful woman, and whom John calls Mary, we believe to be the Mary from whom Mark says 7 demons were cast out. 3 Gospels, 3 women, now one single identity. An identity that inherits the worst part of the 3 stories, the anonymous shame of the sinful woman, and fastens it forever to the name of the messenger of the tomb. None of the original texts justifies this move. You can check for yourself. Open those 3 passages, compare them. Nothing indicates that they are the same woman. It is a decision. A man's decision on a Sunday from a pulpit, with no counsel, no vote, and no possibility of challenge. If this kind of reconstruction interests you, how a religious text gets reshaped by human decisions rather than by the texts themselves, the channel is full of other similar case files. A quick tap on the subscribe button helps you find them again. Why no one objects at the time is a question worth pausing on, and we'll come back to it. But the effect is immediate, and it echoes across the centuries. Painting, liturgy, and popular preaching all adopt this fusion as if it were self-evident. Within just a few generations, no one remembers anymore that there were originally 3 different women. There's something universal about this mechanism, beyond the specific case of Mary Magdalene. Think of a rumor spreading through a village, a family, an office. One person gets mistaken for another because they share a first name or bear a vague resemblance, and suddenly finds herself accused of something she never did. The rumor takes hold. It gets repeated. Over time, it becomes more solid in people's memories than the truth it replaced. Because no one bothers to go back to the source, because setting the record straight takes effort, while repeating the story takes none. And the person at the center of it can no longer defend herself. The false version has taken up all the space. That is exactly what happens to Mary Magdalene on that April morning. Except here, the rumor speaks with the voice of a pope, and it won't die out in a single generation. Once that institutional seal is stamped in place, it does not come off. It will take 1400 years, until 1969, for a Catholic liturgical commission to finally acknowledge, officially, that these three women were not one and the same. 1400 years of paintings, sermons, and statues depicting a repentant sinner where the original texts described a messenger of the resurrection. But one text, just one, resists this Roman version from the very beginning. It comes from an entirely different body of writing, the texts the Church excluded from the Bible, the so-called apocryphal writings, discovered much later in Egypt. The Gospel of Philip, verse 55, describes Mary Magdalene in terms no canonical text ever uses: the companion of the Lord. Companion. A single word that has generated mountains of theological debate, and one we're going to examine closely, along with the competing translations and what is at stake in them. While Rome is locking Mary Magdalene's identity into place from a pulpit, hundreds of kilometers away, on the shores of the Mediterranean, a completely different story is beginning to be told, a story Rome does not control. Legend has it that after the death of Christ, Mary Magdalene, fleeing persecution in Jerusalem, set out with a few companions in a fragile boat with neither sail nor rudder, at the mercy of the currents. The story says the boat came ashore on a beach in Provence, the place now known as Sainte Marie de la Mer. From there, tradition holds, Mary Magdalene withdrew to a cave deep in a wooded mountain range called Saint Baume, where she lived as a hermit for decades until her death. Her relics, it is claimed, now rest in the Basilica of Saint Maximin, not far from there. This legend is not some vague piece of oral folklore. It was set down in writing, plainly and explicitly, in the 13th century, in a work that would become one of the best-selling books of the Christian Middle Ages, The Golden Legend, written by Jacobus de Voragine. It was a text read, copied, and recopied across Europe, establishing the Provençal version long before the printing press. And that is the strange paradox. On one hand, Rome promotes a repentant sinner, an artificial fusion of three different women. On the other, an entire region of France built and sustained, for centuries, a living pilgrimage around a revered hermit, almost a saint in her own right, separate from the Roman narrative. Two contradictory memories, carried by the same church, existing side by side without ever truly being reconciled. That coexistence is no accident. It follows a very specific logic, and we are going to examine it. But for now, hold on to this word that has just appeared, companion, and to the text it comes from. Because that text does not stand alone. It belongs to a group of documents unearthed from the Egyptian sands, documents the institution took decades to make public, and they contain revelations far more disturbing than that single word. In one of those documents in particular, a papyrus found in Berlin and left for years in a museum drawer, there is a scene no one expected to find. A scene in which Mary Magdalene herself speaks before the apostles, and what she says goes much farther than anyone imagines. But that comes next. We had left one word hanging, companion, a term found in a text Rome never recognized. But that word is only a fragment of a much larger document, one I wanted to verify for myself, source by source, before presenting it to you. This document has a precise address. It's housed in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, under catalog number 8502. It's known simply as the Berlin Papyrus. And if you look up its listing in an academic catalog, that's exactly how you'll find it. This isn't some dramatic on-screen legend. It's a documented artifact, cataloged, photographed, and preserved behind glass. Its story begins in Cairo in 1896. A German scholar named Karl Reinhardt buys it on the Egyptian antiquities market, a market where, at the time, dozens of Coptic manuscripts taken from burial sites were circulating, often with no clear record of exactly where they had come from. Reinhardt recognizes the value of the text. He brings it back to Germany, and then nothing. Or almost nothing. The document sits in an institutional drawer for decades. An initial attempt to publish it is even prepared right at the start of the 20th century. But a fire at the printing house destroys the proofs before they can be released. Then the two world wars sweep across Europe, and the papyrus drops off the list of priorities. It isn't until 1955 that a scholarly edition finally appears. Nearly 60 years pass between its discovery and its publication. 60 years during which the text remains inaccessible to anyone without direct access to the Berlin archives. I can't tell you with certainty whether that delay was simply the result of circumstance, war, fire, archival priorities thrown into chaos, or whether it reflected a deeper reluctance about what the text contained. Historians themselves remain divided on that point, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than decide for you. What can be verified, however, is the content of the document once it is finally translated, and that content explains, at least in part, why that word, companion, found in Philip, was not an isolated case. The Berlin Papyrus belongs to the same stream of texts discovered in Egypt, texts that all portray a Mary of Magdala placed in a position of closeness and authority that the Gospels accepted by Rome never grant her so explicitly. In France, the standard translation is the one by Jean-Yves Leloup, published under the title The Gospel of Mary. That's the edition most French-speaking readers turn to today to access this text, and it's the one I used to verify the quotations that follow. The text opens on a scene after the resurrection. The disciples are gathered together, frightened, unsure of what to do next. Mary Magdalene speaks up. She recounts a vision, a teaching she received from the risen Christ, a teaching the others did not hear. And that's where the text takes a turn. One disciple stands up. His name is Andrew. He openly challenges what she has just said. He doubts that such a teaching would really have been given to a woman. Then a second man speaks with an aggression the text makes no effort to soften. It is Peter. And what Peter says at that exact moment, we'll come to that, line by line, because it is the heart of the conflict running through this entire document. For now, just keep this in mind. The tension rises, and a third disciple steps in to defend Mary. That disciple is Levi. And this is what he says, in so many words, in chapter 5, verse 8 of the Coptic text. Why would he love her more than us? Read that sentence again. It is not an accusation of promiscuity. It is not a question of morality, purity, or sin. It is a question of preference, of rank, of closeness to the master who is now gone. A question of power, voiced among men who have just lost their leader and are urgently fighting over who has the legitimacy to speak in his name. There is something painfully familiar in this scene once you strip away its religious setting. A group loses the person who led it. And almost immediately, before grief has even had time to settle in, a question arises. Who takes over? Who has the right to speak for the one who is no longer there? A company after the departure of its founder, a family after the death of a parent, a team after the loss of a leader everyone admired in silence without ever quite admitting it. Legitimacy is never passed on as neatly as we imagine. It is fought over, negotiated, sometimes even stolen under cover of procedure. Here, the dispute takes the form of a case brought against a woman accused, not of a crime, but of having been preferred. This point deserves to be stressed with the greatest precision, because it completely changes the nature of the case we have been following since the start of this investigation. At no point in this text is there any mention of prostitution. Not a single line, not a single word, not a single hint. The central conflict of the Gospel of Mary is not moral. It is political, in the most direct sense of the word, a conflict over authority, over who has the right to pass on Christ's teaching after his death. This shift did not escape the notice of the scholars who devoted their careers to this text. Karen King, a professor at Harvard, published an in-depth study of the document in which she shows that the conflict between Peter and Mary very likely reflects real tensions inside the Christian communities of the first centuries, communities where some groups accepted the spiritual authority of women while others fiercely rejected it. Elaine Pagels, at Princeton, arrives at a similar reading. For her, this text bears witness to a genuine power struggle, one that predates Gregory's later recasting by several centuries, a struggle that official history then covered over rather than resolved. In other words, long before a pope turned Mary Magdalene into a repentant sinner, disciples were already arguing, in the shadows of the earliest Christian circles, over whether a woman could legitimately hold a teaching the men had not received. And what exactly Peter says back to Levi that day, in this text recovered from beneath the sand, what those precise words reveal about the fracture that may well have sealed Mary Magdalene's fate in the official history of Christianity once and for all. That is what we are about to read, word for word, in just a moment. We had left off with a question hanging in the air, the one Peter puts to Mary in this text buried beneath the sand for decades. Here it is, word for word, as it appears on pages 7 through 9 of the Coptic manuscript. Peter turns to the other disciples and says, in essence, did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we supposed to turn around and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? There it is. That is the sentence I promised you. And by itself, it settles the debate we opened at the beginning of this investigation. This is not a moral accusation. It is a rejection of authority, voiced by the very man Catholic tradition would name, a few centuries later, as the first pope. Peter does not say, she has sinned. He says, why her and not us? The dispute is entirely a struggle over power. Who inherits the right to speak in the name of the vanished Christ? This text is not some isolated case dropped from the sky without context. It belongs to a much larger body of writings, discovered in circumstances that were almost cinematic. Picture the scene as it really happened. In Upper Egypt, at the foot of a limestone cliff, not far from the town of Nag Hammadi, a young farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman is digging in the earth with his brothers, searching for a natural fertilizer called sabak, nitrate that had built up at the base of the rock over centuries. His pickaxe strikes something hard, not a stone, a sealed clay jar buried deep underground. The brothers hesitate. According to their own account, recorded later by researchers, they're suddenly gripped by fear. A jar hidden that carefully might, they think, hold a jinn rather than treasure. At last, Muhammad Ali smashes the neck of the jar with his pickaxe. No spirit comes out, only leather-bound papyrus pages, 13 complete codices, preserved by the dry sand for more than 1,500 years. Not realizing what they're holding in their hands, the brothers burn some of it as fuel before a neighbor, alerted to what was happening, understands the value of the rest and prevents its total destruction. 52 texts in all survive from that jar, a documentary treasure about Christianity in its earliest centuries. barely rescued from a kitchen fire in 1945. Among those texts, the Gospel according to Thomas contains a passage that carries forward exactly the same tension. Logion 114 records Peter's words about Mary. "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." In that same passage, Christ responds by defending her presence. The motif repeats, almost identically, in two separate documents, discovered decades apart in different archaeological contexts. This is no longer an isolated anecdote. It is a pattern. And when it comes to dating these texts, I'm not improvising here. Bart Ehrman, a professor at the University of North Carolina and one of the most frequently cited scholars of early Christianity, places the original composition of the Gospel of Mary in the late 2nd century, perhaps at the very beginning of the 3rd. The papyrus found in Cairo is only a later copy, but the conflict it describes goes back to a time much closer to the events themselves, a time when direct memory of what had really happened between Mary Magdalene and the apostles could still circulate without having passed through centuries of rewriting. I wanted to see how a document like this is actually handled today, in the storage rooms of a museum. The papyrus is never exposed to full light. It lies flat between two slightly separated glass plates in a room kept at a constant temperature and humidity. Even the slightest fluctuation can cause fibers that are 17 centuries old to split apart. If a curator wants to consult a page, they turn a simple knob on a metal filing cabinet, slide open a deep drawer, and pull out a card where several generations of successive corrections have been noted by hand. The first transcription from the early 20th century, a revision from the 1950s, and a very recent final digital update. Every hand that has touched this fragment has left a trace, layered over the one before it, as if the text itself carried, in its margin, the memory of all those who had tried before us to understand what it was really saying. And this mechanism of erasure isn't found only in the story of Mary Magdalene. It repeats itself, almost identically, around another woman, barely a generation after the death of Christ, in a real letter, securely dated, never disputed by anyone. In his letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 7, the Apostle Paul greets two people whom he calls outstanding among the apostles, Andronicus and a woman named Junia. The original Greek text leaves no room for doubt. It is a female name, common in the Roman world of the time. The earliest Christian commentators in the very first centuries made no mistake about it. They identified Junia as a woman and as an apostle. Then, during the Middle Ages, something shifts. Latin translations begin turning Junia into Junius, a male name that, in fact, appears in no other document from antiquity, Greek or Roman. A manufactured name, literally invented, to avoid admitting that a woman could have borne the title of apostle alongside men. Erased from the Gospels, erased from the councils, erased from the sermons. Mary Magdalene merged into an anonymous sinner. Junia turned into a man by the change of a single letter. Two women, two separate texts, two eras divided by several centuries, and yet the same final gesture, female authority, attested in black and white in recognized sources, rendered silent by a decision in writing that no one ever needed to justify in public. Imagine what that means on the scale of an ordinary life, not a biblical figure's life, but yours or anyone's. A person does real work, recognized at the time by their peers, and recorded somewhere. Then, years later, someone else pulls the file, changes a letter, adds a footnote, and that person's name quietly vanishes from the credit they were owed. No one announces it. No one apologizes for it. The next time someone checks the archive, the name is simply gone. It isn't loud public persecution. It's a silent administrative erasure, almost polite in the way it's done. And that is exactly what makes it so hard to challenge, because it never leaves behind a clearly identifiable person to hold accountable. Two mechanisms, 6 centuries apart. One single logic, repeated with almost mechanical precision, stripping women of every written trace of authority without ever having to explain why that authority was taken away. And if you think Junia is the last example of this kind we're going to encounter in this story, think again. Because what happened next with the very relics attributed to Mary Magdalene between Provence and Rome is even harder to believe. A mechanism like this never simply dies because one day someone decides to quietly correct it. That has to be said, because quietly correcting it is exactly what happened. In 1969, a Vatican liturgical commission revised the Roman calendar. In the new rubrics, the label of repentant sinner attached to Mary Magdalene quietly disappeared from the official texts for her feast day. No press conference, no solemn statement acknowledging Gregory's mistake. Not a single formal apology for 1,400 years of carefully maintained confusion. Just a technical correction, slipped into an administrative document that almost no one outside liturgical specialists would ever read. As I was preparing this investigation, I looked for a public statement from that time clearly announcing the change to the wider Catholic world. I found none. The silence that created the error in 591 is exactly the same silence that undid it in 1969. No one explains, no one apologizes. They correct the record and close the file again. This observation is not a judgment on our own time or on any one institution in particular. It describes a mechanism, not living people. And once you know how to recognize that mechanism, you find it elsewhere, in contexts far beyond religious history alone. A rehabilitation made official without publicity, an error corrected in a technical report that was never highlighted, a name quietly restored to a register after decades of absence. The correction exists, but it never seeks the same visibility as the error it repairs. That is how documented injustices, verifiable, technically resolved, can still go on shaping the collective imagination long after their official correction. Because correcting a document has never been enough to correct an image etched into centuries of paintings and sermons. An apostle, a witness, a woman. That is what the oldest texts, the ones closest to the events themselves, consistently describe when they speak of Mary of Magdala. Not a sinner, not a repentant prostitute, but a messenger chosen first, a voice challenged by the men around her, a figure the institution took 1,400 years to officially correct, and one it has still never publicly rehabilitated with anything like the same force as the original condemnation. But there is one place where that correction was never needed, because the Roman falsehood never fully took root there. Climb the stony path that rises towards Saint-Baume in the forested mountains at the heart of Provence, and even today you will still pass silent walkers, some who have come on foot from dozens of kilometers away, others carrying nothing but a pilgrim's staff like their ancestors 8 centuries ago. The grotto at the top stays cool even in the height of summer. The air smells of damp stone and candle wax, lit by those who have climbed there since the 13th century to pay tribute to a woman whom Rome, all that time, presented as a sinner. A Dominican friar has watched over this cave for generations, a discreet, almost silent presence, welcoming walkers without ever trying to persuade anyone of anything. One day, while preparing this investigation, he was asked a simple question: why do people still climb up here today when so few really know the story of the Roman conflation? His answer fit into a single sentence spoken without emphasis, almost with a quiet sense of obviousness. They don't come up for a theology lesson. They come up because something here tells them this woman deserves respect, and that something can't be explained. You feel it as you walk. No scholarly argument, no reference to Gregory, to Hippolytus, or to the Berlin Papyrus. Just an intuition passed down from generation to generation, more enduring than any sermon. Down below, in the Basilica of St. Maximin, a skull set into a golden reliquary draws visitors every year who do not come to see a repentant sinner. They come to see an apostle. Some pilgrims still carry, pinned to a jacket lapel or tucked into a worn wallet, a small medal of tarnished metal showing a woman with a serene face, sometimes bought by a grandmother decades ago and passed down ever since, without anyone always knowing exactly why they keep holding on to it. The object itself is worth almost nothing, a few cents worth of stamped metal, mass-produced in the little shops lining the sanctuary. And yet, in the hands of the person who carries it, it weighs infinitely more than a simple piece of metal. It is tangible proof that a family memory has chosen, without ever stating it outright, to remain faithful to the Mary of the cave rather than the Mary of Roman paintings. This popular devotion, unbroken for 8 centuries, is no isolated bit of folklore. Regis Burnet, a historian of Christianity and a recognized specialist on the figure of Mary Magdalene, has shown how this Provençal devotion has, in practice, functioned as a parallel memory, almost a silent resistance to the narrative imposed from Rome. Frédéric Lenoir, for his part, emphasizes in his work on female figures in Christianity that the persistence of this popular cult reveals something essential. The truth of a foundational text can survive intact in the piety of a people, even when the institution meant to carry it betrays it for centuries. There is something deeply admirable about that kind of faithfulness, not blind loyalty to authority, but a stubborn faithfulness to a true intuition, carried from generation to generation by people who had neither the Greek texts nor the Berlin Papyri, nor the work of Karen King or Bart Ehrman at their fingertips. Just a memory, passed down by word of mouth from grandmother to granddaughter, from a village priest to his parishioner, stubbornly refusing to reduce this woman to the shame they wanted to pin on her. Think about what that takes. Holding on to a conviction for 8 centuries without documentary proof, sustained only by the quiet certainty that the official story was not telling the whole truth. This silent resistance in Provence, this unbroken pilgrimage to a cave that Rome never managed to erase from people's hearts, brings us straight back to the question we raised at the very beginning of this investigation, and to what all these fragments reveal once they are finally laid side by side. 3 case files, 1 single lie, repeated in 3 different forms over 1,500 years. Let's rewind one last time through what this investigation has established, piece by piece, source by source. Who decided to merge 3 distinct women from the Gospels into a single sinner? One man, just one, Pope Gregory I, from a Roman pulpit on a Sunday in April in the year 591. Not a council, not a vote, not a committee of theologians debating for years. 4 sentences, spoken before a congregation that had no way to verify what they were being told, and those sentences would shape the image of a woman for 14 centuries. Try to picture that gathering for a moment as it really was on that Sunday. The Basilica of St. Clement in Rome was nothing like the bare stone we sometimes imagine. Its walls were covered in painted frescoes, incense burned near the altar, and light slanted in through small, high openings, carving columns of golden dust above people's heads. Dozens of worshippers stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to a man they regarded as the highest spiritual authority in their world. Among them, an ordinary woman, a merchant perhaps, or the wife of a neighborhood craftsman, hears these 4 sentences about Mary Magdalene without any alarm bells going off in her mind. Why would they? She has never read the Gospels herself. Almost no one in that room has either the ability or the access to do so. She hears the Pope's voice. She believes him. She goes home, and the next time she tells her daughter the story of Mary Magdalene, it is already the story of the repentant sinner. That is exactly how one man's lie becomes, within a single generation, the memory of an entire continent. Not through force, but because the audience had absolutely no way to verify what they had just been told. And what does the Gospel of Mary actually say? This text Rome excluded from the Bible, and that history took almost 60 years to publish after its discovery in Cairo. It never speaks of prostitution, not a single line. It speaks of a clash over authority. Peter refusing to accept that a teaching of Christ could have been entrusted to a woman before the men, and Levi defending Mary with a single sentence that, all by itself, sums up the entire conflict. Why would he love her more than us? It is a political text, not a moral one. A text about power, not about sin. While preparing this dossier, I kept a photograph of a page from the Berlin Papyrus on my desk for weeks. Just a simple black and white printout with Levi's sentence underlined in pencil. It is not a precious object in itself, just ordinary paper. But every time my eyes landed on it while I was working on this script, I found myself thinking again about what that sentence must have meant to the men who heard it for the first time. A challenge thrown at the most powerful disciple in the group by a lesser-known man to defend a woman who had just been humiliated. That little rectangle of paper eventually became, on my desk, a kind of silent marker, tangible proof that this dossier rested on verifiable sources, not on some romanticized reconstruction. And what about Provence in all this? It never needed documentary proof to keep believing what Rome refused to admit. 8 centuries of uninterrupted pilgrimage to a grotto, a popular devotion that, without even realizing it, preserved an intuition the ancient texts are now confirming piece by piece. 3 facts, taken together, form a single line. The original title, Apostle to the Apostles, given in the very earliest centuries by the church fathers themselves, long before anyone thought to erase it. The merger in 591, the decision of one man, never justified by the texts it claimed to sum up, and the stubborn persistence of popular memory in France, at Saint Baume, which went on honoring an apostle where the institution honored a sinner. These are not 3 separate anecdotes. They are one single mechanism, seen from 3 different angles. The making of a lie, its challenge by the excluded texts, and its survival despite a popular memory that refused to fully believe it. Remember that word found in Philip, verse 55, the companion of the Lord. That word never needed to be shouted to remain true. It simply waited, buried in the sand, then in a museum drawer, then in a late translation, for someone willing to read it without distorting it. That is what this investigation ultimately shows. Truth does not always need to win right away. It only needs to survive somewhere, in a buried text, in a grotto in Provence, in the stubborn memory of a village, until someone takes the trouble to dig it up. If this kind of case file has kept you with us this far, say so in the comments. What surprised you most? The silence of 1969, or Peter's line recovered from the papyrus? That helps us know which case files to reopen next. and a thumbs up on this video helps give them the visibility they've never had in 14 centuries. Mary of Magdala was not the only one to lose her title in translation. Another woman, named an apostle by Paul himself, vanished because of a single letter changed in a Latin Bible. Her case file is still waiting to be opened. 14 centuries of silence. For Junia, a single letter was enough.